really can't win or lose an argument about this ADHD construct. Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Berger. Welcome back to AIM Truthcast. Today we're going to be looking at the subjectivity of the ADHD construct. It will be critical, but I think it's important that you understand you really can't win or lose an argument about this ADHD construct. If you dialogue, if you debate, if you argue, it is so subjective that no one has the same definition. In fact, if you pause for a second and you write down your definition, as we go through this, especially as we get to the phenomenology, you will see that your definition likely does not even match the DSM. And as you will find out today, even if it does match the DSM, it is entirely subjective. So let me pause here and say, in the weeks to come, I'm going to be doing videos on the phenomenology of ADHD. In these videos, I'm being critical, and I think that's appropriate. Again, we're to destroy every argument raised against the knowledge of God, especially those that are destructive and impairing to our children. We'll actually be going through the quote-unquote criteria, the 18 behaviors and the additional criteria of the construct of ADHD. It's easy to criticize without giving an alternative, and so I want to give you a clear alternative that you get to choose which worldview, which perspective that you are going to approach children, maybe even yourself, from. I don't get to decide that. I'm simply going to lay out a biblical phenomenology of the exact same behaviors that the DSM lists. And certainly you can do this for all constructs. I want to show you 10 ways in which the construct of ADHD is subjective. Again, if you have not seen the previous videos on ADHD, I just want to make it clear that the behaviors that are being classified as ADHD, the actual phenomena, are very real, very troubling, and need to be addressed. But the ADHD construct itself is subjective. It was created by man. It's really, as I argued in the previous video, a failure to explain a child's quote-unquote maladaptive behavior. And as we continue to this discussion on the construct, I want to make it clear that not all the behaviors are moral failures. In other words, we cannot say that all of the 18 behaviors are sinful. That would be a mistake. That would be actually extra biblical. It would be just as damaging in many ways as what psychiatry is doing in saying that none of the behaviors are moral issues, that somehow there's something wrong in the body, something physically wrong that is producing these behaviors. And so let's jump into these 10 things. Why 10? There's more things. I'm just going to give you 10 things today. So the first thing I want to offer you is that every assessment of a child's behavior is in fact based on some type of hermeneutical lens, some type of moral interpretation. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation, and it usually has to do with words, although it definitely applies to evaluating and critiquing other things in life, behavior being one of those. I want to offer you a biblical perspective on this, and that is Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 11 that says, even a child is known by his conduct, by his behavior, by his works, whether his conduct, his behavior is pure and upright. So each of us has a moral hermeneutic. We all have a lens that we're actually looking through in order to interpret a child's behavior. And I say it is subjective. It is subjective by the fact that we can choose which lens that we want to interpret behavior. We can look at it through a bioreductionistic view or an objectivism view, or we can look at it through a biblical lens. We get to choose. It's subjectively dependent on your choice. I am not in any way saying that Scripture is subjective, nor am I saying that the science that supports Scripture is subjective. The second way in which the ADHD construct is subjective is that the 18 behaviors are actually set up to be subjective. In fact, if you read these 18 behaviors that are divided into essentially two groups of 9, the first being inattention, and the second group of 9 being hyperactivity and impulsivity, you will see that each of these criteria, each of these behaviors begins with the word often. In other words, it states, for example, often gets out of his seat when expected to remain seated. Well, how many times would qualify a child as being ADHD? Well, it's left to the evaluator. It's actually left to the teachers or the parents to evaluate and decide what they would say is too many times of getting out of seat, or climbing where it's inappropriate, or cutting in line, or giving an answer before it's asked. These are some of the behaviors that are listed in the DSM. And so it actually requires a subjective evaluation, again, whether it's the clinician, whether it's the teacher, or the parent. So there is no way, even if you agree with the DSM entirely, for this to be objective, because it's designed to be subjective. It's just a reality if we actually take the DSM for any authority, any validity, and any reliability. It has to be subjective. Number 3 is that there is no objective definition of ADHD. It doesn't matter how you define it, no one agrees on that definition. In fact, I want to cite Dr. Ed Howell and John Rady, who are considered to be two of the experts on the ADHD construct. Another is Dr. Russell Barkley, who I'll also cite either today or in a future video. Nonetheless, listen to what they say about the definition of ADHD. We do not have one concise definition for ADD. Instead, we have to rely on descriptions of symptoms to define ADD. And that is from their book, Driven to Distraction, and they do have new ones that they've written. Nonetheless, I want you to understand there is no agreed upon definition of ADHD. We are now faced with defining something that no one agrees on an objective definition of. No wonder you can't win or lose an argument, a discussion, a debate, a dialogue about the construct of ADHD. But note again what they actually say, that the construct is defined by the symptoms. Think of the circular reasoning behind this. Let me give you an example of this. How do we know that a child's behaviors are ADHD? Well, because ADHD is defined by the behaviors. And you can see this circular logic. It's a logical fallacy, really, to take the very descriptions as if they are defining the thing that you're trying to create out of the descriptions. It is illogical. And that brings us to the fourth concern that we need to look at concerning how subjective this construct is. And that is that it is a reified construct. In other words, it's the error of reification. They have taken a concept, an idea, a hypothesis, which is what ADHD is. It's a theory about behavior. Again, the behaviors are very, very real. No one is debating that. But the theory about those behaviors is what ADHD is. It's from a secular, humanistic, Kreplinian objectivism that essentially has to reduce everything to being explained within an evolutionary framework. And so this hypothesis, when it is accepted as if it is real, in other words, it's never been found, but it exists in nature according to this speculative concept, that means they have reified it. They have tried to make it real in an objective way and in an organic way. ADHD exists as an idea, as a concept, as a construct. It exists inorganically, but yet we cannot find this thing called ADHD physically. It is not real in a physical sense. And that is important for us to discuss here. Let me give you an example of this from the secular literature so you don't think I'm the only one seeing this. And this is from Frontiers in Psychiatry back in 2022, not too long ago. Listen to what they say about the ADHD construct. The descriptive classification, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is often mistaken for a disease entity that explains the causes of inattentive and hyperactive behaviors, rather than merely describing the existence of such behaviors. The present study examines discourse on ADHD to analyze how authors passively and actively contribute to reification, a fallacy in which a concept is represented as a thing existing on its own. So you can see here how ADHD is treated as if it's something that exists on its own, when really it's defined entirely by the quote-unquote symptoms, by the phenomena, by specifically, in this case, the behaviors, the 18 behaviors. And I do realize there's some other qualifications that are also subjective, which we'll get to. You can see how subjective this is. I can shape and frame this concept any way that I want, and that's what happens as they have transformed it over the years, because it actually doesn't exist physically in nature. Now, I can cite the DSM, and I have the DSM here. I can cite the DSM, but you can actually look at the DSM and evaluate it and see if what I'm saying is true or not. You can't do that with the construct of ADHD. They can essentially change it as they go, and it's okay. Of course, they blame it on science advancing, but it's not science advancing at all. It's just simply a fluid construct that can be changed because they have reified it. You're convinced that it's real in the sense that it exists in nature, and yet it's still a concept. It's just a hypothesis by a bunch of evolutionists, by a bunch of humanists. And again, until they can show physically this is ADHD, as they can a cancer cell, for example, or as they can neuroencephalitis, they can actually go to the brain and show what an infection looks like, etc., then it is being reified. And this allows for the subjectivity of this construct. It allows people to believe that something is real without it actually existing physically in nature. I'll do a whole video on reification because it's such an important concept for us to understand as Christians, and the deceit, the faith that is required, sadly, in evolution, in humanism, in order to accept these reified constructs. Now, in a previous video on the ADHD construct, I looked specifically how the 18 behaviors are normative. This is something that everybody struggles with, whether it's remembering things, whether it's especially children getting out of their seat when they're expected to remain seated, or butting into a conversation, or interrupting people, or simply speaking your mind when it's not your turn. These types of behaviors are all normal, and yet they're allegedly criteria for ADHD. And so qualifier between normal and abnormal is also subjective. So here are some of the qualifiers in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. This is what they call the Bible of psychiatry and where ADHD actually exists. This is where ADHD can be found. And the first qualifier, or the first axiom, if you want to call it that, is that the child must exhibit these behaviors in a period of 6 months or more. Now, why 6 months? That is entirely subjective. Why not a year? Why not wait till the child is 21? We are content to say that these normal behaviors within a 6-month period, if they're, here's the second axiom, severe enough or intense enough, or they're repeated enough. Those are two subjective qualifiers. Well, who gets to decide what is severe enough? And some terms actually are thrown around like clinically significant. So in other words, if the clinician says, hey, this is significant enough, well, how do you know as a clinician if it's significant enough? Well, I'll tell you what I would do if I was in a secular mental health clinic. If somebody came to me to get help for their child's behaviors, I would say that is clinical. In other words, they said there's a problem, therefore anyone who came to my office should be considered as clinical. Again, that's my subjective opinion. It makes sense, it's rational, and so I would be able to choose that within my own clinic. You can see how dangerous this is, but it also just verifies what I'm saying, that this is entirely subjective. There's another qualifier as well, that it has to be observed in 2 or more settings. So It can't just be the classroom. It can't just be the home. It can't just be the church, anywhere else that you want to throw that in. It has to be in 2 or more settings. Well, who decided that? Who decided 6 months? Why not a year? Again, as I've stated, why not till age 21? Why don't we wait till age 21? All of these are subjective markers that can be opposed at will or not. And I just want you to understand that no diagnosis of cancer, for example, is determined by some subjective assessment. This is all based on, should be based on, unless it's malpractice or just a preliminary diagnosis, is just guessing, a placeholder diagnosis, then it has to be objective to be in medicine. And this is subjective. All these axioms are actually subjective. They are not objective. Moving on to number 6, and this one absolutely blows my mind every time I teach on it. The ADHD construct is subjective because there's listed 2 types of constructs within the ADHD idea. And so just to give you a perspective, they have quote-unquote subtypes of ADHD, being a child is just inattentive or heavily inattentive, or just impulsive, hyperactive, or a combination. But then there are these other 2, other specified and unspecified ADHD. I kid you not. And if you go through these, it essentially says that the clinician who subjectively thinks the child is clinical, he looks at them and says, there's enough clinical impairment here to say you have ADHD, but you actually don't meet the criteria. You don't have 9 of the inattentive or 9 of the hyperactive impulsivity, or a combination, 9 of the combination of these 2 groups. But yet I feel like you have ADHD, and so I can say why you have ADHD apart from what is written in the DSM. This just opens the fluidity even more, and there are many kids that actually do not fit the ADHD description. How do I know this? Because I've sat down with numerous families, and as we lay out the behaviors, as we talk through the behaviors, and then we look at the DSM, we start realizing that they may have 3 or 4 that actually fit into the ADHD construct within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but they don't qualify according to the DSM criteria, and yet they have been on psychiatric drugs and carried this label for months and even years in some cases. So I just want you to understand, when you start looking at this, a doctor can say and actually state why they're giving a diagnosis, or they can say, you know what, I'm going to give this unspecified ADHD, other unspecified. I'm not going to actually tell you why I'm saying you have ADHD, but you have it. And a diagnosis can be given. And this is the kind of thing you cannot make up. And I'll just say this as well. There are many psychiatric constructs within the DSM that carry this other and other specified and unspecified moniker. And so that's really telling to us how subjective these constructs are. I mean, imagine being diagnosed with cancer and someone coming out and saying, you know what, I'm not going to tell you really why I'm diagnosing you with cancer. I just feel like you have cancer. Doesn't make sense at all from a medical perspective if, in fact, medicine, and I believe it should be, and I believe good practitioners do this, if medicine is objective, and it should be objective. I want to make that clear. Number 7, I don't want to take too much time on this one because I did discuss this in a previous video, but I want to note that when a child receives a diagnosis of ADHD, it's simply a redescription of the description. Usually it's the parents or the teachers that are filling out the behavioral assessments, and so the clinician is just simply reading what has been assessed, what has been described already, and they're redescribing it. They're taking a description and agreeing with it and saying, yes, you have attention problems and you have activity problems, and in some cases hyperactive problems. You have an attention deficit hyperactivity. And really the idea of deficit isn't even a good nomenclature. As I discussed in the previous video as well, there are many cases where it's an interest deficit, not an actual attention deficit. Nonetheless, it is entirely subjective for us just to give a label that reiterates something we already knew. It redescribes a description. It's not a discovery at all. And so anything that can be described can be redescribed and pretended like a construct created and then pretended like that construct exists in reality. Again, that's reification. So you can see how all this goes hand in hand. We are accepting in a subjective concept as if it is an objective reality that physically exists somewhere in our bodies or somewhere in nature. Number 8 is that your view of normal will determine your view of alleged abnormal. So if my view of normalcy in regard to childlike behavior for a specific age is different than your view, then who is right? How do we know? Are kids supposed to behave a certain way? Let's take activity, for example. The idea of hyperactivity. What is the right amount of activity that a child should have? Should all children have this same normative level? And how do we even measure that? Do we even have a standard right now? And the answer is, of course, no. Every child is uniquely designed by God, is gifted by God, and that energy, if it is gifted with self-control by the Spirit, by the Holy Spirit, and the parents teaching this self-control, this self-discipline through their own discipline of the child, that will allow the child to behave and take control of energy. But if it's absent, then we should expect out-of-control behavior. High energy is not the problem. And again, there is no standard of normal when it comes to energy, or it comes to getting out of your seats, or when it comes to cutting in line or answering a matter before it's been asked. So you can see how our view of normal determines our view of abnormal, as I've stated before as well, that you cannot have a deviance if a standard does not exist. I want to quote Dr. Russell Barkley on this, one of the best sellers on the construct of ADHD. In fact, one of his books is called, unbelievably, ADHD and the Nature of Self-Control. Now, I've already told you about executive function and executive control in the previous video of how sleep impairment is known to impair our ability to choose between right and wrong, to have emotional control, to discern what is good and what is bad, etc. But what about self-control apart from any sleep issues? And I want you to hear what Dr. Russell Barkley says in the prologue of his book, ADHD and the Nature of Self-Control. Any theory of child psychopathological conditions such as ADHD will ultimately have to be linked to larger theories of the nature of normal developmental psychological processes and the neuropsychological processes that comprise them. Pathological states are variations from normal states. An understanding of the development of those normal psychological functions, therefore, can provide substantial insight into this development of the psychopathological condition. In short, the literature about psychological disorder and that about its normal developmental counterpart must be bridged at some point in theory construction. Consequently, any theory of ADHD is of necessity a theory of executive functions and self-regulation or self-control. So you can see here that his view is evolutionary. That is his lens. That's his hermeneutical lens that he's viewing a child's behavior. He's got to fit every single behavior into that framework. And that is why ADHD exists. What is normal? What is abnormal? Now, the irony of this is evolution has no normal view. If you study the concept of evolution, it states that everyone is evolving so that everyone should be on a spectrum of human development anyway. We should all be in different places. And so really there cannot be this concept of disorder within evolution. And that's a whole nother argument, but it's kind of humorous to think about They don't have a standard of normal, and yet they're dogmatically telling us what is abnormal. So you can see how subjective this is. Let me cite one more article before we move on here from one of the world's leading psychiatric geneticists, Dr. Kenneth Kindler, and his colleague Peter Zacher. Kindler and Zacher write in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and they're going to reference Dr. Thomas Szasz, who is now considered to be a, quote, anti-psychiatrist, got labels for everything, by psychiatrists, because Thomas Szasz was a psychiatrist who essentially realized that what he was doing was entirely subjective and conjecture. And so he began to write and expose psychiatry. Fascinating reads, and of course, psychiatrists do not appreciate, many psychiatrists do not appreciate what he has written. There are exceptions to that. But listen to what they state here as again, they write in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Thomas Szasz claimed that undesirableness was typically articulated from the perspective of a particular social class, the middle class, and particular political cultural viewpoint, Western individualism. Szasz argued that problems in living were being misclassified as illness. In response to these challenges, Wakefield articulated the harmful dysfunction model. Its purpose is to help professionals differentiate legitimate psychiatric disorders such as conduct disorder from unpleasant conditions that are not disorders, such as adolescent rebellion. According to the harmful dysfunction model, an attribution of a mental disorder has two components, the first of which is harmfulness, meaning that behavior is maladaptive for the individual. Maladaptive refers to a devalued condition or a problem in living. The second component is dysfunction, meaning that something has gone wrong with an organism's cognitive, emotional, perceptual machinery. The organism is not functioning the way in which evolution designed it to function. So you can see here the problem with saying that evolution designed something. If it happened by chance, there's not design. There can't be impulsivity and prudence. There can't be luck and sovereignty. And if there's no sovereignty, there is no design. And so they're making an assertion that really is God's, but they're trying to attribute it to evolution. You want to talk about a jump of faith here. Nonetheless, he's pointing out that you have to have a standard of health, of normalcy, of proper function in order to have dysfunction. Now, I mentioned that this is objectivism, and I won't go into that philosophy here. It's a much deeper conversation that I surely will do videos on, probably not in the near future. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of philosophies to dig into that undergird. There are always presuppositions that undergird the psychiatric theory. And I would argue there are presuppositions that undergird our view of a child's behavior as well. And those are simply the truths found in God's Word. We are spoiled because we have objective truth that doesn't fail. It rightly understands, describes, and remedies human nature. And it's a wonderful thing that we can trust in the words of God rather than the alleged wisdom of man. And that brings us to number 9. The DSM is claimed to be a comprehensive, fully developed, fully explaining objective book. However, I want you to listen to the reality of that. First, I'm going to read Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, who chaired the DSM-5, not the text revised. I've got the text revised here. I also have the DSM-5 just without the text revised. If you open the non-text revised version, he is in there as the president-elect. He was in charge of producing, if you would, the DSM-5. Listen to what he says about the DSM. This authoritative compendium, the DSM of all known mental illnesses, is known as the Bible of Psychiatry, and for good reason. Each and every hallowed diagnosis of psychiatry is inscribed within its pages. What you may not realize is that the DSM might just be the most influential book written in the past century. Now, I want to pause here and just say there's a lot of truth to what he's saying, because ADHD is an example of this. We are interpreting ways of thinking, emotions, real internal experiences, real phenomena, thus it's called phenomenology, real behaviors according to this psychiatric Bible instead of the Word of God. Again, as I mentioned to you in future videos, I'm going to point out to you how the Word of God rightly understands everything about us. And yet we have these two very different lenses to evaluate, and in this case, it's behavior. He goes on to say, its contents directly affect how tens of millions of people work, learn, and live, and whether they go to jail. It serves as a career manual for millions of mental health professionals, including psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and psychiatric nurses. It dictates the payment of hundreds of billions of dollars to hospitals, physicians, pharmacies, and laboratories by Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance companies. But the manual's greatest impact is on the lives of tens of millions of men and women who long for relief from anguish of mental disorder, since first and foremost, the book precisely defines every known mental illness. It is these detailed definitions that empower the DSM's unparalleled medical influence over society. Let me re-emphasize that. The book precisely defines every known mental illness, except this one is subjective. It is these detailed definitions that empower the DSM's unparalleled medical influence over society. Again, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, from his book Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, page 87 through 88. Now, I want to point out to you, he's saying it is based on how we have so rightly defined and described every known mental disorder. We've done this very well, he says, that gives us the authority over society. It's a scary premise to consider, scary to think about what we have accepted. All right. However, listen to what the DSM-5 that he, again, sat over, listen to what he allowed to be published in the DSM-5. Again, this is not the text revised version. This is just the DSM-5. The DSM Task Force wrote, the symptoms contained in the respective diagnostic criteria sets do not constitute comprehensive definitions of underlying disorders, which encompass cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and physiological processes that are far more complex than can be described in these brief summaries. And that's again on the DSM-5 non-text revised, page 19, in the very introduction. So which is it? Are these non-comprehensive, or are these so comprehensive that authority should be granted to them? Well, there's a problem here, is there not? And so this is an entirely subjective idea that they're telling us is, no, you've got to trust us. This is the Bible that you need to trust. We have the authority to tell you how to interpret behavior, but then they admit, hey guys, this isn't really comprehensive, so take it for a grain of salt. And they go on actually in both the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 text revised to say the boundaries between these constructs are fluid. They're really just a subjective idea. It's a hopeful interpretation. It is a hypothesis, and that's exactly what ADHD is. And that brings us to our last point today, that there are no objective physical markers that can be said to be ADHD or evaluated to make an actual diagnosis. The diagnosis of ADHD is entirely phenomenological. It's based on symptoms or phenomena rather than looking at the body. A diagnosis can be made just by looking at someone's symptoms on paper rather than looking at the body. Now, I'm going to shock you here, and I went through this multiple times. I actually read the entire section on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Do you realize not one single mention of some type of physical malady? For example, the eyes and the ears, which are the attentional organs, the senses of looking and listening, are key to giving attention. I mean, we're talking about attention here. The eyes and the ears are not mentioned one single time in the DSM-5. That is telling to me. In other words, I would understand if there were sensory processing issues like in the construct of autism. That's a valid physical problem. And of course, there are other seculars have classified sensory processing issues as their own different category. I understand that. I realize that. I'm just simply pointing out here that the eyes and ears are significant to everyone's paying attention, and there is no mention of something physical that could be evaluated there. That is troubling. Sleep is actually mentioned in there, but hardly at all. In fact, it's suggested that just about half of the children who are labeled struggle to sleep. But it's just mentioned at the very end in passing. But the eyes and ears are left out. This is a huge problem, and it should be a problem to you as well. I want to cite a friend of mine, Dr. Peter Bragan. Dr. Peter Bragan was a full-time consultant for the National Institutes of Mental Health. He also was the key witness, the psychiatric witness against Ritalin in the Columbine shooting. Ritalin is a stimulant that helped aid these young men in killing these children at Columbine. It's a sad reality. And Dr. Bragan was the psychiatrist who was asked to come in and show how Ritalin, because it disrupts sleep, should be implicated. And so Dr. Bragan is a friend of mine. We've done conferences together. I've been on his radio program. We still stay in touch. He is someone that is really turned away from the Kriplinian system. He's someone that is realizing we've got to get back to caring about people. Unfortunately, he hasn't done that from a biblical lens, from a biblical perspective yet. Continue to pray for him. However, he is a smart guy, and I'd encourage you to check out some of his things on his website. Listen to what he says about ADD, ADHD. A great deal has been written about ADHD and how it does not constitute a valid diagnostic category and fails to meet the criteria for a medical syndrome. Divided into three categories of behaviors: hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention, the ADHD diagnosis is nothing more or less than a collection of behaviors that cause problems for teachers and require their increased attention in the classroom. In short, the diagnosis has no validity in terms of representing an underlying disorder or meaningful syndrome. It is actually a list of behaviors with infinite potential causes. That's from his book, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, on page 75. So you can see here, this is not a physical problem, it's a behavioral problem. That's just the reality of this. We're not talking about an objective problem in the body. We're talking about a subjective judgment about children's behaviors, and the physical problems, again, that can be attributed both to the psychiatric prescription drugs as well as to not sleeping well, are then attributed to this mystical construct. It's a really sad place that we've come in accepting this subjective reality of ADHD. Now, I've mentioned that these are phenomenological diagnoses rather than biological diagnoses, but I want to cite another psychiatric journal, and that is Biological Psychiatry. Alicia Martin, Mark Daly, Elise Robinson, and Stephen Hyman, as well as Benjamin Neal. Stephen Hyman is a very influential psychiatrist. Listen to what they say. In psychiatry, biomarkers, something found in the body, are very much needed for both research and treatment, given the heterogeneous populations identified by current phenomenologically based diagnostic systems. So you can see that these are phenomenologically based diagnoses. These are not biologically based. In fact, they're saying we need biology, we need biomarkers, not only for diagnosing, but for research. They have these constructs, but they actually don't have biology. They've gotten it backwards here. You also see this term again, heterogeneous, which just means it's a fluid thing. No one looks exactly the same. And that's what I'm trying to point out about ADHD. There's not really an objective understanding or definition of what we're calling ADHD. And finally, I want to cite the DSM itself. Listen to what it says specifically. In the absence of clear biological markers or clinically useful measurements of severity for many mental disorders, it has not been possible to completely separate normal and pathological symptom, abnormal behavior, expressions contained in the diagnostic criteria. And that's from the DSM-5 non-text revised on page 21. Right from the beginning, in the introduction, they're saying if there's no biology, we really can't distinguish objectively between normal and abnormal. I would agree with that 100%. The fact that there is no biology means that the construct is entirely subjective. It is and it has to be subjective. In fact, on page 61 of the DSM-5 non-text revised, it specifically states that no biological marker is diagnostic for ADHD. Listen to what another prominent influential psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Francis, who chaired the DSM-4 task force and chaired psychiatry at Duke University, says about this very troubling reality of the lack of objective biology, the lack of biomarkers and pathology. A biological test is a huge disadvantage for psychiatry. It means that all of our diagnoses are now based on subjective judgments that are inherently fallible and prey to capricious change. It is like having to diagnose pneumonia without having any tests for the viruses or bacteria that cause the various types of lung infection. So you can see that they're lacking not just for the diagnoses, but the actual construct itself does not exist physically. They can't research this, even though they say there's a bunch of science. They can't diagnose this according to biology, only phenomenology. It's based on the phenomena, the behavior. They have no physical, objective way to evaluate human nature. So here are just 10 ways in which the ADHD construct is subjective. Again, I'm not trying to be mean. In fact, I'm trying to be loving. For the sake of these children, we need to stop stigmatizing them and calling them disordered and abnormal. Yes, they have behavioral problems, but it's something we can work through. And in fact, it may be an asset that God has designed them to have in the future. If self-control and wisdom are obtained, if they gain that through loving discipline, through loving guidance and direction in their life, gaining knowledge and understanding and prudence, and making that permanently part of their character. Every child needs this. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you'll share it. I hope that you'll like it. And I hope that you will really consider the truth of God that can set us free.